Hello and welcome to the Creators Guild podcast. I'm Chris Howell, and with me,
Jared Lovelady.
and we're here to talk about all things creative. We're going to start off as usual, Chronicles of Duradam. We're going to read from A Flight from Shadows, and we're getting pretty close. So next week will be the very end, but not today. Today, Chapter 32, Fleeing from Shadows, Cycle of Ryo, year 12182. When darkness reaches its clawed hand, attempting to steal away all you hold dear, sometimes there is no other choice but to flee. It takes both strength and preparation to stand and face the shadows. The only known complete scroll from the time of the cataclysm, author unknown. By the time the need to arise had come, Tawara had been up and out of bed for over an hour. She had spent the time in contemplation of what her life would be like once she and Athandra took their leave of the Bronze Palace. Abruptly, a knock came at the door. She looked to Athandra, still asleep in the bed, before crossing the room to gingerly open the door. To her surprise and relief, she realized there was no one there. She searched the hallway in both directions. There was not a soul in sight. As she began to shut the door, she happened to look down. There on the floor in front of the door sat 2 pairs of stout leather shoes, the kind one might find being worn by a good wife on a farm. Tawara opened the door to retrieve the shoes. It was then she noticed that what she had missed in her initial inspection of the hallway. Hanging on the back of the door were 2 woolen dresses, one in a light hue, the other dark green. She quickly took up the dresses and shoes and closed the door. She held each up to her approximated fit and cringed at the thought of the rough wool against her skin. The one of the light brown wool simply would not do. There was not enough room in the fabric for her curves. Why did she have to be so atypically shaped for a high elf? She groaned as she held up the dark gray dress. The color was dreadful. What was worse, as she held it up to herself, it looked a perfect fit. Athandra, wake up. It's time to get ready. It will be dawn in less than an hour, she called to the woman who she now thought of as friend. Athandra sat straight up in bed. What? Huh? What's wrong? Nothing is wrong. It is time to get your lazy rump out of bed, is all. It will be dawn in less than an hour. She held up the light brown dress. Someone brought gifts. Athandra scrubbed her face in her hands. Oh, lovely, she said, and wrinkled her nose at the dress. And shoes, Tawara added, and held up a pair of the sturdy leather brogans. As Athandra dragged herself out of bed, Tawara removed her robe, walked to the wardrobe, and pulled out a shift. Pulling it over her head, she let the silk garment envelop her. At least she would not be forced to tolerate the rough wool over her whole body. Next came the dress. The dark gray wool felt coarse in her hand. There was nothing to do for it, however, so she pulled it over her head and smoothed it down over her bust and hips. As she feared, a perfect fit. A little too perfect fit for her liking, to be honest. The cut of the dress accented her every curve, a situation that under normal circumstances she would have found perhaps a bit exciting. She now found rather inconvenient. Drawing attention to herself was currently the last thing she wanted to do. Come on, get dressed, Tawara prodded. I do not want to be late and have our contact leave without us. I am. The dress is a little snug, Athandra replied as she worked to smooth the light brown woolens over herself. I very much doubt that our contact will leave if we are not there right at dawn. Which shoes are mine? I do not know. Try on a pair and see if they fit, she snapped at Athandra. Sorry, I'm just so... I do not know what I am. I feel insane for doing this. Don't start second-guessing yourself and get cold feet now. We have committed to this plan, and we have to see it through. Tawara grunted and took the remaining pair of shoes. They were clunky things, but they fit her feet adequately enough. She began to pace the floor as Athandra finished getting ready. Stop that and help me get these last few buttons. Oh, and you might want to take that off, Athandra said, pointing to her head. Tawara stopped and felt her forehead. Her fingers touched metal. When had she put on her tiara? Slowly, reluctantly, she removed it and placed it on the nightstand next to the bed. I did not even realize I had put it on, she said as she crossed the room to button up the last few buttons on Athandra's dress. There, you all are all done up. It seems there is nothing left to do but go. Athandra nodded her agreement and took Tawara by the hand. Be strong. Remember, this is for our safety. I know, she replied. Let us be off. Tuara gave Athandra's hand a squeeze and released them as she headed for the door. She checked the hallway to make sure it was clear of any servants or other random passers-by. Seeing it was clear, she left the room and motioned Athandra to follow. The short trek to the east stables was thankfully uneventful. The sunlight was just beginning to lighten the low eastern sky. They found no one in the private quarters area of the palace. Only once they had made their way across the foyer of the palace's main dining hall did they come across a few liveried servants bustling about their morning chores. None took notice of two young women passing through. Once out of the palace proper and into the stables, Tuara began scanning the few occupants for the guard with the yellow ribbon on his arm. It did not take long to find her quarry. "There, over there," she told Athandra, and pointed in the direction of a man who leaned lazily against one of the stable support beams, looking rather bored. Tuara took Athandra's hand and headed in the man's direction. "I believe you are waiting for us," she said to the man in a hushed voice. He was large, with a scar that ran from his left ear to just under his nose. He was built as solid and stout as a bull. His vest, the only clothing he wore above the waist, seemed to strain to contain his muscular physique. "I suppose I am," he replied in a lilting Paramese accent. He looked the two over and nodded. "If you will follow me, I'll get you to where you need to be." Tuara looked at Athandra expectantly. Athandra gave a cool look of approval and nodded. "Very good. Lead the way," Tuara replied. "This way," the large man said, and headed further into the stable. They followed him, dodging horses and stable hands as they went. Eventually he led them to the outer entrance. Large white painted gates were swung open, and wagons hitched with oxen teams in a neat line were exiting. They were assembled in the courtyard outside the stable. The large man pointed to a small, dark green wagon at the end of the procession. "That there is where you need to go," he told them. "Master Elman will take care of you from here. He is the headman of the caravan. Everyone answers to him." "Thank you, sir," Tuara said, and Athandra said in near unison. They made their way across the remaining distance to the green wagon. Seeing no one tending it, Tuara climbed the two short wooden steps of the wagon's rear panel and knocked on the door. They heard someone rummaging about inside, but no answer came. Tuara gave Athandra a questioning look and received a shrug in reply. She knocked on the door of the wagon again, louder this time. "Who the hell is it, and what do you want? I'm busy," came a voice from inside. "We were sent to see you by Captain Ethrin," Tuara said tentatively. After a moment, the door of the wagon swung open. A short, balding man in disheveled clothes that looked slept-in popped out. He had the ashen skin of the Eastern Confederation, but his wisps of red hair that remained around his ears were mostly gray. He gave them a glowering look as his marigold yellow eyes adjusted to the early morning light. "Shh! You want everyone in the stables knowing you is here? Come in, quickly." "Oh, okay, sorry," Tuara offered and quickly ascended the steps and entered the wagon. Athandra followed, and they found themselves crammed in a cluttered space. Clothing, dirty dishes, and all other manner of items were piled in haphazard stacks on every available surface. "Thank you, sir, for helping us," Tuara began. "Stop there. Before you go any further, let's get a few things straight," the odd little man said, interrupting her. "First off, I don't know who you are, and I don't want to. Second, while you are with the caravan, you will do as you're told, by me or by any of the drivers. Lastly, welcome. If you are wards of Captain Ethrin, you must be good people." Thank you," Tuara offered. "We were told nothing of you either, I am afraid. Your rules seem fair enough, however." Athandra nodded in agreement. "Good. Now then, first things first. I can't just call you, 'Hey, girl.' So, we best give you some names, yes? You there," he pointed to Athandra. "You're Ventra, and you, Goldie, will be, how about Zoyetta? Yes, that will do just fine. Now, the good captain saw to getting you all the supplies you will need, and I have horses and a pack animal for you to make the journey." Tuara looked to Athandra and mouthed, "Zoyetta?" Athandra just shrugged with a grin. "Hey, were you listening?" the man asked, snapping his fingers in Tuara's direction. "I'm sorry, good master. Elman, was it?" she asked. Yes, Elman, you can drop the master business. Now, as I was saying, your provisions are all in the packs on your animals. There would normally be the business of the fee for traveling with the caravan. However, the good captain has seen to that as well. He also arranged for me to give you this. I don't see that you'll need it, We are not stopping in any of the towns of note on the way, but here it is anyway. He pulled a small leather purse out of his belt and offered it to Tuara. Tuara took it, appending the contents into her palm. 5 large gold coins, and what she thought to be about 10 small pieces of silver clinked into her hand. The man's eyes popped at the sight of so much coin. I don't know who you are, like I said. Don't want to know. But you must be pretty well important for someone to be supplying you with that much coin, he said, half to himself. We are no one of note, Athandra told him, just 2 women travelers, in need of the security of a caravan as we make our pilgrimage. Well, like I said, I don't need or want to know. Now then, you will be placed just in front of me here at the back of the line. Bandits and such most generally make their attacks from the front, so you should be most safe back here with me. Tuara nodded her agreement. The farther from the possibility of danger, the better in her estimation. One more thing, he continued. I'll have no funny business with any of my drivers. I don't need any of them having the sort of distraction while we travel through rough country. Funny business? Tuara asked innocently. Fraternizing with males, Athandra whispered to her. Oh, no, that will most certainly not be an issue, Master Elman. Good. Now, if you want to go check your supplies and mounts, we're about ready to depart. And see that you care for the horses on the journey. They ain't the best around, but they're what I could spare. Tuara nodded. With Athandra taking the lead, they exited. Walking around the wagon, the ox team, they found their mounts and pack animals. 2 roan mares were saddled, and 2 large saddlebags were slung over their hindquarters. These saddles look odd, Athandra commented as she looked over one of the horses. That is because they are side saddles. Side saddles? What does that mean? It looks like it's only half made. It is for riding without divided skirts. You sit with both legs on the same side of the horse. It is supposed to be more ladylike. It looks like you would just slide off. There's no way I'll be able to ride like that. Tuara chuckled. I hate to admit it, but you might be right. I doubt we have time to procure a proper saddle before the caravan is ready to leave, though. You will have to make do the best you can. You mean walk by the horse the whole way? Athandra asked, rolling her eyes. Come, give me a hand up. We'll see if I can even sit on the stupid thing. Tuara chuckled. All right, let us see what we can do. After multiple attempts that nearly put Athandra in the dirt, on the 4th try she landed in the saddle adequately enough to stay mounted. This is terrible, she said in exasperation. It's so uncomfortable. There's no way I can spend days riding like this, not to mention I'll probably slide off every 10 minutes. It's not all that bad, Ventra. You will get used to it, Tuara said encouragingly. Before she had even finished what she was saying, Athandra began tipping backward. She flailed her arms, and her feet kicked out. Her horse sidestepped nervously at the motion, and Athandra slipped from the saddle and landed hard, going down to her rump. Athandra, are you all right? Tuara asked as she stifled her laughter. I think so. Here, give me a hand. Taking her hand, Tuara heaved to pull her friend up. Ouch! Stop! Athandra cried. My ankle. I think it's twisted. Oh no, this is no time for injury. We must leave with this caravan, she stated before changing her tone. I'm sorry, Ventra. Here, let me help you. Pulling more gently this time, Tuara groaned in exasperation as she hefted Athandra up. Here, can you stand leaning against the horse? She asked. Yes, Athandra answered as she held onto the saddle. She clearly favored her left ankle. Stay here. I will talk to Master Elman and see if we can at least get one proper saddle. If we couldn't afford for you to be falling out before, we certainly cannot, now that you are injured. All right, Athandra said through clenched teeth. Tuara walked back to Elman's wagon and knocked on the door. Master Elman, it's Zoyeda. We have a small problem. A moment later, the small, bald man popped out of the wagon, muttering, Gods, I swear, if Ethrin wasn't such a good friend. What is it, woman? Well, good sir, I am afraid my friend is not very accomplished rider. Her saddle is a bit of a problem. And what, may I ask you, would you have me do about it? The good captain made all the arrangements for your travel. I had nothing to do with it. And frankly, no time to deal with it now. We were supposed to have left already. He stared at her blankly. Tuara felt a hint of frustration. Yes, they were in a hurry, but he wasn't the one fleeing for his life. She crossed her arms and glared at the man, not trusting herself to speak. He stared at her for another moment before he rolled his eyes, releasing a sigh of frustration. Very well, he said, climbing from the wagon. Take me to your friend, and we'll see what all this bother is about. They found Athandra standing next to her horse, leaning heavily on the animal. "Now what's the problem here?" Elman asked, as he approached Athandra. "It's my ankle," Athandra replied. "Your ankle?" Elman exclaimed. "What about your ankle? This one said there's a problem with the saddle. What's your ankle got to do with the saddle?" "I fell," Athandra said at the same time Tuara blurted out. "She cannot ride side saddle. She will kill herself before the day is out." Athandra gave Tuara an abashed look, and Elman looked back and forth between the two as he scrubbed a hand over his bald pate. "I should have demanded more coin from Ethrin, friend or no," he muttered to himself. "Your ankle, you say? Now, you can't ride side saddle? Well, that would have been good information to have before this morning, now wouldn't it?" He turned to Tuara. "Do you think you could manage getting your friend up on the bull-whacker?" "Excuse me?" Tuara said, staring at him blankly. "What?" Elman replied in confusion. "What?" Tuara replied back. He looked at her in exasperation. "What the hell is going on? Can you get her on the bull-whacker or not?" "I do not know what you are talking about," Tuara retorted. "What in the name of the gods is a bull-whacker?" "The seat woman on the front of the wagon. Can you get her up on the driver's seat of my wagon?" "Yes, of course I can do that. Just say that, instead of words that don't make any sense." "My words?" He shook his head, trailing off. "Just help her up to the seat. She can ride by me, and you can figure out the saddle when we get to Samunis. Now get her up there. I've got to get us moving." He turned back toward the wagon. "What about the horse?" Tuara asked after him. He spoke over his shoulder. "Tie it to the back of the damn wagon. God's woman, use your head." He continued walking, muttering loudly to himself. "I think she never saw a wagon or rode a horse before. Words that don't make no sense. Bah!" Tuara shook her head at his back, and turned to see Athandra grinning at her. "Do not say a word," she said, as she stomped over to Athandra and looped an arm around the other woman's waist. "I wasn't going to say anything," Athandra replied with a small chuckle. The mirth cut off when Athandra tried to put weight on her foot and limped forward. "It is not so funny now, is it, my dear Ventra?" Tuara shot at her, with no real heat in her voice. It did serve her right. This adventure was off to a wonderful start. They would probably break their necks along the route and save the assassins after them the trouble. "Oh, Zoyetta," Athandra said through gritted teeth, "you know I enjoy a good lover's spat." Tuara felt a flare of anger at Athandra's flippant remark. Then the statement registered in her mind, and laughter burst from her mouth. "Careful," Athandra replied, and winced as she too giggled. "Oh, that hurts. But you two really do make a lovely couple." "Shut up," Tuara giggled back. "We've got to get you up into the bull thingy." Athandra let out another laugh, cut off by a wince of pain. They shuffled their way to the front of the wagon, and Tuara half-supported, half-shoved Athandra up, where she tumbled into the driver's seat. She nearly fell out the other side. Athandra shifted and got herself upright and settled before turning to Tuara. She straightened her now disheveled hair as she looked down and breathed heavily. "I'll be all right now. I'm sorry, Zoyetta." "It is all right, Ventra. We will make it, one way or another." Tuara smiled up at her friend. "I'll go get the horses set. I'll ride beside you if I can, and we can talk. And you will not have to focus on not falling out of the saddle as we journey." Athandra rolled her eyes at Tuara, and Tuara grinned back as she turned away and retrieved Athandra's horse and pack animal. She tied the reins and the pack animal's lead rope to the hitching rings at the back of the wagon. She then went to her own horse and mounted, reining the animal over beside Athandra. She was just in time as a shout went up and the lead wagons began to leave the courtyard. Elman came shuffling over and scrambled up to join Athandra. "Well, this will be a cozy journey," he said sarcastically. "Just don't jostle me off the seat. I doubt you know how to drive oxen if I fall and break my neck." In moments, it was their turn, and they moved forward at a crawl, joining the rest of the caravan. Tuara urged her mount forward and rode alongside the wagon. She sat easily in the middle and rocked gently with the motion of the horse. How long would it take for them to reach the monastery at this pace? She voiced the question to Master Elman. "Are we going to ask questions the entire way?" he responded grumpily, not answering. Tuara scowled in his direction, but Athandra blocked him from the effort of the glare. They rode in near silence for most of the first day. The hours passed slowly. She wondered if their absence in the palace had been discovered yet. Would they be able to hide in the caravan if the palace sent out riders to search? Perhaps they could hide in Elman's wagon. They would have to come up with something, she supposed. Hopefully they would not have to face anything like that along the way. In the early afternoon, Elman finally seemed to relax, and some of his crotchetiness dissipated. In keeping with his desire to know as little about them as possible, he did not ask them any questions about themselves. Instead, he began to speak about his experiences traveling between the realms for many years. He told them of the many peoples he had met, threats from bandits, and the solitude that existed on the road. Once he started, he told stories almost non-stop, as though he were making up for all the years of riding alone on the wagon seat. Tora didn't mind. It seemed to help the time pass, and he was actually a good storyteller. She didn't know that she believed everything he said, especially stories he had heard about ancient flying creatures or beasts that lived in the barren wastes, but still it was entertaining. When he spoke somewhat longingly about some of the exotic meals he had experienced in various cities of the five realms, and how meals on the road were monotonous and lacking, Athandra piped up that she knew how to cook. This came as a shock to Tawara, along with the realization that she knew nothing about cooking, besides the basic skills of survival. Elman smiled brightly, resisting, at first if half-heartedly, before accepting Athandra's invitation to join them in their evening meals. After that, he took on an almost grandfatherly tone with Athandra, and his communication toward Tawara softened a bit as well. When they stopped for the night, Tawara set up their small tent, consisting of waxed canvas draped over a pole and staked to the ground so as to make a small triangle to crawl under. It was more than a tight fit for the two, but they managed without too much overlapping of one another. They did have fur ground cloths to sleep on, which improved the comfort immensely over sleeping directly on the grass. Athandra, with her hobbled leg, insisted on doing the cooking. Her ankle was a little puffy, but she said the time off it during the day had made an improvement. Tawara brought her the foodstuffs and water, and then went about setting up the temporary camp while Athandra prepared the meal. Elman joined them, a pleasant smile on his face. Athandra had made a stew of sorts, and Elman eagerly took a proffered bowl from her. Tawara accepted one as well. The day had been long, and she was famished. She scooped a spoonful of a stringy mixture of things she didn't quite recognize and took a bite. She coughed at both the texture and the heavy use of pepper. She assumed the stringy portions were some sort of meat, while the other pieces had a squishy, pasty quality to them. "Are you all right, my Zoyetta?" Athandra asked. "Oh, yes, it's just hot. I should let it cool a bit." She sat her bowl beside her, trying to put on an innocent face. "How do you like it, Elman?" Athandra asked him pleasantly. Tawara felt bad for the man. That was really an unfair question. "Oh, it's really unique. Yes, that's the word I would use. I've been traveling for years, and I have never quite had anything like it that I can think of." He smiled at her, giving her a wink, and Athandra grinned back. "I'm glad you like it. I made enough for a small second helping, if you finish your bowl and would like more," she offered. "Oh, I don't eat so much these days," he said, patting his stomach. "If I was younger, I'd take you up on it, but I find my appetite just ain't what it used to be." "Well, you just help yourself," Athandra replied, "and you too, Zoyetta." Athandra took up her own bowl and sat close to the fire, happily enjoying her meal. Tara watched, a bit astonished. Did she even know this woman? Was she eating the same food? She glanced over at Elman, who stared despondently into his bowl and pushed a spoon around. He occasionally took a nibble. After a time, he sat his bowl down and thanked Athandra as he got to his feet. "I've got to make the rounds and see that everything is in order. You two get some rest and see that you take care of that ankle," he said, before turning to shamble away into the evening dusk. "He is not so bad once you get used to him," Athandra said, ladling herself more stew. She proffered the ladle in Tawara's direction. "Oh, no, thank you, Ventra," she said, placing her hand over her bowl. "Come now, Zoyetta. You were complaining all evening about how hungry you were, and I've seen how much you eat. We need to keep our strength up out here." She pushed the ladle over Tawara's bowl and began to tip it. Tawara had no choice but to move her hand and let Athandra fill her bowl again. "Thank you," she said through a forced smile. After the first night, Alma did not join them for dinner again. He expressed his regret each night, but said he had too many demands as the caravan headman, and each night found some reason not to be present at mealtime. Each evening, after his rounds checking on the state of the caravan, Alman returned to his fire and treated the ladies to more of his stories. What Tawara found even more interesting than Elman's stories of the realms was the gadgets he kept about the wagon. Strange things, mostly made of brass, or some other dull silver metal that felt lighter than metal should, in her opinion, were fascinating, even if she couldn't puzzle out what they were made to do. Elman was reluctant at first to discuss them, but after a bit of casual prodding, over several evenings he began to open up. As he told them of his home, he spoke fondly of the treasures his people had, the vast knowledge they kept, and the discoveries they had made over the centuries. "It's a shame none of the other peoples of Duridim will accept what we have to offer," he said, rubbing his bald pate, as was his habit when thinking or when frustrated. By his tone, Tuara expected it was a bit of both. "The Saparans run all of Perome. I know they won't say it outright, but our discoveries are an affront to them and offend their precious gods." He looked pointedly at Tuara and Athandra. "And you elves, for whatever reason, none of you will use our science for anything useful. It's just a novelty to you, but it sure makes our lives better." He scratched at an ear before he rubbed his head and thought again. "I just can't help but think how much more we could learn from each other if we all shared our ideas. But I can't even take most things into the other realms without being called a heretic. Gotta keep things locked away in my wagon." Athandra perked up hearing that. "Do you have inventions in your wagon? We'd like to see them. We won't call you a heretic." "Well, now," he said, considering, "you two are a bit different from most other elves. Most high elves are pretty arrogant and look down at me. Much as I like old Ethrin, even he can be a little pompous. And wood elves are friendly, but they'd rather make you dinner and move on than sit down and talk with a fellow that's from foreign parts. But you two," he paused again, "well, I think you just might appreciate something Brundian." He stood, waving them toward the back of the wagon. "Well, come on then. Better come take a look before I change my mind." Tuara was barely ahead of Athandra as she leapt to her feet. They waited for Elman to climb the small steps, where he paused at the wagon door. "Now don't touch none of my stuff, you hear? I have things set just the way I like them, and I don't need anybody messing up the way things are. Understand?" They quickly nodded their agreement and followed Elman as he turned and entered the wagon. They found themselves once again surrounded by clutter. Tuara had thought maybe Elman had cleaned and organized since their first encounter in the wagon. Apparently, the way I liked them for Elman meant a state of chaos and disarray. He shuffled to a small stool and indicated for Tuara and Athandra to sit on his cot. Athandra plopped down on a pile of rumpled bedding and clothes. Tuara shrugged and followed suit and tried not to show her mild disgust. At least things appeared clean, and there were no bad smells. Elman opened a drawer at the built-in writing desk. He retrieved a wooden box carved with animals and inlaid with small gems. With some reverence, he removed the lid and drew out a brass clock with metal hands that looked like intricately twisted vines. Tiny gears in the face whirred when it was wound. It reflected light from the oil lamp and cast sparkling patterns on the wagon walls. "There now," he said. "Isn't that beautiful? The one on the wall there is practical," he said as he pointed to a larger plain-faced clock on the wall above the small cook stove. "But this is a work of art. It was a gift from the Duchess of the Martov clan in West Aldora." "The Duchess of where?" Tuara asked. She didn't recognize any of the names Elman was referencing. He gave her a sour glare. "Aldora. It's where I'm from in the east of the Confederation. I'm of the Martov clan." He coughed a bit. "Or, at least I was. Not really sure these days. The Duchess's husband wasn't too happy with our, association. That's more or less how I got into the traveling business." He trailed off at the end and gave himself a visual shake. "Anyway, it's one of my prized possessions, and only a small sample of the inventions from my homeland." "It's marvelous," Tuara said as she touched the gleaming metal. "I've seen a clock before. It was a gift from my father. To my father, from a Confederation delegate. After the delegation left, he said he appreciated the gesture, but that high elves didn't need such trinkets, and had it put away." The little clock brought back memories of her father. After her mother's death, he had become more interested in Brundian discoveries. He kept little trinkets in his room and occasionally brought them out to show visitors. He had gained a reputation for being somewhat eccentric, particularly after having a mechanism installed to open the main doors of the manor house. Her reminiscing was interrupted by Elman's protests. "You see what I mean?" Elman asked. "You don't need trinkets? Bah, it's a clock. It tells you the hour. How is that not useful?" He shook his head and rolled his eyes as he gently placed the clock back in its box. "I don't get it." "I suppose that could be handy if you really needed to know the exact hour of the day." "Who needs to know the hour so precisely, though?" inquired Athandra, with a quizzical look. Elman looked at her dumbfounded. Who needs to know? Girl, don't make me regret thinking you were different. You may not know how to ride a horse, but I thought you were smarter than that. I don't need to change my assessment, do I? Athandra hunched down a bit on the cot, looking abashed. It's all right, Elman said. I guess maybe it takes some time to see things can be useful, if you aren't used to them. It's a different world, really, that we all live in. Now, he said, sounding a bit more light-hearted, when it comes to trinkets that have no purpose, we have plenty of those, too. He stood and began rummaging. Zoyeta, go fetch the kettle off the fire. I'll show you something truly useless, but quite entertaining. Something useless but entertaining? Twara was definitely interested. She rushed from the wagon and quickly returned with a steaming kettle, excited to see something new. What possible use could these have? Athandra asked. I can't see a thing through them. I've seen dust goggles before, but what are these supposed to be good for? Twara, just entering the wagon, nearly dropped the kettle as she laid eyes on Athandra, a guffaw bursting from her lips. Your eyes! They're huge, Twara blurted through laughter. Athandra wore a leather cap pulled tight over her hair, with an attached pair of oversized goggles that covered her eyes. She waved her hand in front of her, as though she were trying to find her way through a darkened room. Elma joined Twara in laughter. Silly girl, those are for tinkering with small gadgets and such. The old eyes just don't see as well as they once did. Taking a book from the desktop, he opened it and held it in front of Athandra, inches from the large convex lenses. There, see? Oh my goodness, the words are enormous, she said, as she pulled the cap off her head and held it up for Twara. Here, Zoyeta, you have to see this. Twara quickly sat the steaming kettle down on the cook stove. She took the oddly shaped leather cap with its oversized lenses and inspected it for several moments. She pulled the cap over her golden locks and settled the lenses in place. She held her hand close in front of her eyes. Oh my, I can see every little wrinkle and hair on my hand. Here, Ventra, give me the book. I must see. Athandra took the book from Elman and guided it to Twara's hands. She held it close and studied the words on the page. They were at least 5 times as large as they should be. Zoyeta, look, she heard Athandra say. Twara raised her gaze from the book and was met with a giant set of eyes and a monstrous nose. She jerked back and let out a squeal. She thumped her head against the wagon wall with an audible thud in the process. Athandra doubled over in laughter, to such a degree that she nearly slid off the cot. Ow, Twara said, and chuckled as she pulled the cap off with one hand. She rubbed her head where it had struck the wall with the other. I think I had better take these off before I find a way to creatively kill myself. Elman chuckled as he reached out to take the cap and then tossed it into the desk. Yes, it is best to wear those while seated. He returned to his stool. Now, I think you'll find this quite interesting, he said, as he placed what looked like a small horse, made of a metal barrel covered with gears on the wagon floor in front of him. The kettle, Zoyeta, if you please. Twara carefully reached for the kettle and handed it gingerly to Elman. He twisted a small cap off the back of the barrel portion of the horse and poured the steaming water into the opening before he quickly screwed the cap back on. Immediately, steam began to roll from the horse's nostrils. After awaiting several moments, Elman reached down and nudged the horse's rear end. There was a short hissing sound as a small plume of steam shot from the nostrils, and the gears around the barrel began to rotate. Incredibly, the legs of the horse started to move, and it stumbled forward in a stuttering step. Each time a leg moved, a small hiss of steam would escape near one of the joints. Athandra let out a squeal of delight as the small creature shuffled its way across the wagon floor. Is it magic? Twara asked, wary of the small mechanical animal. Elman gave her a flat stare. Magic, he stammered. Now don't you go getting stupid on me, too. It's science, girl, steam power. We have all kinds of things in Burundia that work like this, mechanical wagons and whatnot. This is just a child's toy. He shook his head, muttering to himself. Magic, of all the silly. Twara ignored him and leaned close to watch the tiny horse as it continued to walk. Steam power. She had no idea what that meant, but didn't want to push Elman's patience any more than they already had. Besides, at this particular moment, she didn't care. This was fascinating. Abruptly, the horse stopped and let out a sad-sounding hiss as the gears stopped turning. What happened? Twara asked, looking up to Elman. Did the steam lose its power? Elman looked at her, dumbfounded. Did the steam? He trailed off, shaking his head again. He reached down and seized the horse from the floor. Well, I think we've had about enough of our demonstrations for one evening. You two should get yourselves ready for the night. He put the horse into the drawer and rose from his stool before lifting the kettle from the stove and holding it towards Tawara. Good night to both of you, he said, waiting expectantly for them to comply with his dismissal. Tawara sat stunned for just a moment. He really could be temperamental. She stood, taking the kettle and smiling. Thank you so very much, she said sincerely. I am truly impressed by the amazing creations of your people. His expression softened slightly at her words. Well, now, maybe we'll do this again another time, he said, a bit hesitantly. I do have other things you might enjoy, but not tonight. She nodded and turned to walk out of the wagon and down the steps, Athandra following her out. Thank you again, Elman, Athandra said, and have a good night. Yes, yes, he replied. Good night. As he shut the door, Tawara could hear him muttering, Did the steam lose its power? Backward, unscientific. The rest of his words were cut off by the shutting door. That was abrupt, Tawara said, looking at Athandra, who burst into laughter as she turned to limp toward their tent. Tawara followed, returning the kettle to the fire as she did so. By the third morning, Athandra moved around well on her injured ankle. She said she would try the saddle again, but Elman would not hear of it. Tawara was grateful for his insistence. The last thing she needed was for Athandra to fall and break something. They passed other travelers in various caravans along their route. No riders ever came asking about the missing princess and her handmaid. No word had reached any of the small towns or villages they passed in the lower country of their disappearance. This was not all that surprising. The wood elves rarely took stock in the matters of the high elf court. There was a noticeable difference in the lands around them that Tawara pointed out as they crossed from Kuvia to Adamar. The road followed the contours of the large, winding river known as the Dragon's Throat in a constant descent. The high plains gave way to lush lowlands. The trees changed from the mostly evergreen that populated the high elf region to predominantly deciduous. The underbrush and grass of Kuvia were replaced by softer ferns and the like. They took on deeper greens in their large leaves, some with an almost blue hue to them. On the fifth evening they stopped at a large wooder village with an open market. Apparently Elman's caravans were known for trading with the locals, and he was welcomed gladly by the mayor. That night the full caravan joined the villagers for a banquet of sorts. Wood elves were known for their welcoming and hospitable ways, and this was shown in abundance. A minstrel band filled the air with wooder music. Athandra sang along with many of the tunes. She raised her voice cheerfully and clapped to the rhythms. Still favoring her ankle, she did not join the dancing. Instead, she watched from her seat. She insisted, however, that Tawara join in the revelry. She pushed her out onto the green after Tawara turned down her third invitation to join in. The mayor told stories of a past that he and Elman shared that evoked laughter from both villagers and caravanners alike. Tables were spread on the village green, and a dinner of roasted meats, pastries, and various side dishes were provided by the villagers, a delicious, welcome respite from the campfire meals of the caravanners. When Elman sat down at their table with a large plate of roast lamb, herbs, potatoes, and spicy summer squash, Athandra looked at him speculatively. Elman, are you going to be able to eat all of that? Oh, he replied, looking at his plate, then back to Athandra. Well, I only come this way once in a while, and I don't want to offend anyone. He leaned over and whispered to Athandra secretively. They always give me more than I can eat, but the good wives here would be offended if I did not finish every scrap. He sat back and gave her a wink and a smile. Oh, Athandra said as she reached over with a fork and a knife. I understand completely. I won't tell anyone. She halved his lamb and stabbed half with her fork before lifting it over to her own plate. She proceeded to load on a few potatoes and some of his squash. There, she said, smiling conspiratorially over at him. It will be our secret. She began eating, and Tawara had to stifle her laughter. She felt bad for poor Elman, who sat looking forlornly at his half-empty plate. Later, she spotted him, hiding behind his wagon with another plate of food and a small plate of pastries. He looked up and saw Tawara and nearly dumped everything in the grass at his feet. Tawara made a calming motion with her hands. He picked up on her signal and gave a grateful smile before returning to his meal. After the meal ended, Tawara sat with Athandra by their small campfire. She considered how different things were here from Avalonia. She had never witnessed a welcome such as this for any visiting dignitary, much less a trade caravan. Do all the towns in Adamar welcome caravans in such a way? She asked Athandra. I know Elman is a friend to the mayor, but is it not a bit excessive to celebrate The visit of a caravan leader? Thondra tapped her chin as she stared into the fire. She spoke distractedly. Not every village. This one is close to the border of Kuvia. The closer to the border, the more accommodating my people become. She looked at Tuara, her face expressing a mixture of sorrow and spite. It's another sign of the faction among my people. Just like East and West are nearly at war in Kuvia, the divide grows more among my own people. The villages close to the border seek so much to appease the high elves, they have nearly lost themselves to the idea of appeasement and assimilation, and show it through grand celebrations for anyone traveling from Kuvia. She looked away, picked up a stick, and jabbed it into the fire as though it deserved the assault. Tuara considered for a moment before she inquired again, But, Ventra, you came to my house to be the handmaid to a princess. She looked around, making sure there was no one to overhear her. You may not throw celebrations, but do you not do the same thing in your own way? You appease the high elves and accept high elf custom and rule. I know, Athondra said in exasperation, throwing the stick into the fire. She sighed and shook her head as she watched a shower of sparks flutter into the air. I know I do it too. We all do, all the Wooders. I don't know why we do it. Even those who oppose high elf rule can't seem to stand firm. It just feels wrong. Sure, we'll bluster a lot, but when it comes down to it, we don't have it in us to truly push back. She turned to Tuara, her face forlorn. It's just in our natures, I guess. It's better to go along, even seek out position within your people's society, even if it makes us unhappy. We'll fight amongst ourselves, should we not assimilate. We fight, we just can't do it against the high elves. We're not strong enough. She shrugged and turned her head to face the fire again. Tuara leaned forward and gently wrapped an arm around Athondra's shoulder. Well, you are the strongest person I know. Who else would run off in the middle of nowhere to save a friend? Maybe I did it out of my need to appease you, Athondra said, dryly, jabbing Tuara in the ribs with a finger. Tuara let out a grunt, then squeezed Athondra tighter. Why do you call it a village? She asked, changing the direction of the conversation. It is a fairly small town, but I would not quite reduce it to the level of a village. It is tradition. All communities within the Wooder lands are known as villages. A silly custom, really, but one that helps reinforce our unique sense of family that is shared by all the wood elves. They all share the same circular layout, with streets that point like spokes of a wagon wheel from the green at the center. The village gazebo in the green is the focal point of social life. That's where we had the feast tonight. They were silent for a time before Athondra spoke. How are you doing with everything? Tuara shrugged in response. She had tried not to cry herself to sleep every night, yet more nights than not she found herself held tightly in Athondra's comforting arms. They didn't converse any more after that. Sitting quietly, they watched the fire until it burned down to coals as they took in the quiet of the evening in each other's company. The last 3 days of the journey took them off the smooth roads they had traveled thus far and into rougher terrain. They began to climb into foothills, and the nights got colder. Tuara was grateful for Ethrin's knowledge of where they would be traveling and the preparations he had made. The fur-lined cloaks were far from the finest cut, but were a welcome addition when the sun began to set. Mid-morning of the 8th day, the caravan rounded a rocky outcropping, high in pine-covered hills. Suddenly, what looked like a large stone fortress appeared, nestled amongst the dense trees below the towering cliff face. The sun shone down on red walls surrounding a fortress of red-tiled towers and spires. Tuara took in the sight, relief flooding over her. At long last, they had arrived at Samunas and safety.
All right.
The end of chapter 31.
The end of the chapters.
The end of the chapters, yes. My throat kind of... And having a little friend on your lap while you're trying to read. I got to hold the book like just right. I don't want her to get up and suddenly decide, I need to bark in the middle of what's going on. So, yes, a lot more to come. Very much lot. Yeah, last night we were digging into, we did again what we had been doing before. Where we're looking at like book 14.
Mm-hmm.
the very end of the book, saying, okay, we got to do, here's this wrapping up scene. Here's how we need to accomplish X, Y, and Z to make sure this closes out correctly and we don't have any big gaps. And we need to know that because what we're doing for revisions in book 2, like 6 chapters in, we're like, we got to know where this is going to go.
Yeah, it's very complex and very intertwined, and you don't realize when you start writing, you
Yeah.
have this grand story you want to tell,
Yeah.
and all the detail that comes into that is
Yeah. So that's something we were talking about, like topics for tonight and whatnot. And kind of thinking about like what are some themes or some things that come up in stories or any kind of storytelling, movies, books, whatever, that just, no matter what the story is, no matter what it's about, it makes it worth it, at least from my perspective. And to me, I like all the little details that go in that then show up here. And sometimes they're kind of like little Easter eggs. Sometimes they're really important to the plot. And it's like, remember that one line that this one character said 3 books ago? And then it gets revisited 3 books later. And you're like, that's why that was in there. Like at the time, I wasn't sure what was. I was like, oh, that's just kind of an interesting piece of lore or an interesting piece of history.
yeah. Which things that are just interesting pieces of lore, just interesting history, that's also something that I really like in a book or
Yeah.
a story or a movie or whatever. That world building. I like to be able to immerse into that.
Yeah.
But then when it has a payoff later, it's just that much better.
Yeah, it's like double whammy. Yeah, I read a lot of different stories, and I do like some stories that are like fast paced, get through the plot, get through the thing real quick, adventure is happening over and over and over and over again. I like some stories like that. But I also find, I get through it and then I'm like, well, that was over really fast.
Yeah.
Um, reading, have you read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory?
I know I've read parts of it. I don't know. I don't think I've ever actually just read it all the way through.
Yeah, so it's when you get into Chocolate Factory and you get into these things, Roald Dahl wrote it, and I mean, it tells the whole story of Charlie being poor and finding and like what the chocolate is and Willy Wonka and the Oompa Loompas and all the things that happen with the book. It's a, if you're holding it up, it's like a 1-inch thick book. I don't know how many pages it is. 130, 150 pages, maybe.
I don't know.
Something like that. I don't know how many words it is. 80,000 words, maybe less. I don't know. Should look it up real quick. But I'm like, I really like the story, reading the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I like, there's a lot. Yes, I get it. The target audience it's a kid's story.
It's only 30,000 words.
30,000. Oh yeah. So really short. I mean, would that be considered a novella today?
It might
Maybe.
be. That's pretty short.
Yeah. I'm like, you get all these elements, but like I do like the writing style where there's so little detail that you just get to imagine whatever you want to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's Gene Wilder as Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory, or Johnny Depp in Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, there's some things, there's some like patterns there and whatnot that are the same, but or that have the same setup. But a lot of it is just, well, we know it's a big chocolate factory. We know it's got like this crazy stuff that happens. There's a chocolate river. There's the boat. Like the whole environment and the setting and the history and all that. Like, you don't get any of that. There's not enough.
Yeah.
There aren't enough words in the book. But that also means you get to picture whatever you want.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think a good story gives you both.
Yeah.
Where it gives you enough detail that you understand what's there and what's going on, but it leaves it just vague enough that there's room, or maybe gives just enough detail that there's room for your imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with some, the Wheel of Time, we've talked about the Wheel of Time a lot. We've talked about Brandon Sanderson's books a lot. You know, his, the different, they both, like, they describe everything.
Yeah, they're very detail oriented.
Yeah. You walk into a room, you know everything about that room and every person in that room, what are on the tapestries. Like, you almost know, like, what's the thread count of that rug. You know? I mean, he even describes at one point, you know, the feel of the sheets that somebody's laying in and whatnot, or not just coarse wool, but how coarse is the wool and what's the difference between the different wools that, you know. So you can extrapolate from that and be like, well, if you're talking about this level wool, that's this thread count. And this, you know, it's not actually wool. You know, that's alpaca.
Yeah.
You know, or whatever. No, cashmere. That's cashmere. That's what you're talking about, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoy. I guess what I would summarize that as, I like information, the writing style to be intentional. I like the storytelling style to be intentional. There's a filming strategy or filming type that people use sometimes, and I've only seen it in like the last 10 years. I can't think of it before 10 years. It kind of makes me think of found footage shows, where it's like the camera's shooting into a room and there's people talking, moving, and it could even be like a period piece. And all of a sudden it's like the camera's kind of shaky and it's kind of following things. And I'm like, hold the camera still. It's like someone shooting a home video.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And like, there are some films that are shot that way that have that kind of shaky texture to the cinematography the whole time. Like, okay, if it's like that the whole time, you kind of get used to it. And, you know, it doesn't throw you off. But there are some shows. So I watched Downton Abbey. I mentioned this before. There are 1 or 2 episodes of Downton Abbey where I don't know why. Like, for them, like, the camera, most of the filming is all like, it's smooth, follows the characters. It's very much, it's Anne of Green Gables, you know, Sullivan Entertainment filming.
Yeah.
It's BBC, whatever, you know, broad scenes, and then zoom up on people's faces for some emotion and stuff.
A lot of staging.
Yeah, very much everything stage set. Cameras are moving just like in and out, unless it's like a big pan scene where it's up above a building and coming in. Other than that, it's like, this is the stage and the camera's got to catch the whole thing. But there's 1 or 2 scenes, you know, there's a lot of, like, they're following somebody through the house, down a hallway, around a table, stuff like that. That happens constantly. But there's 1 or 2 episodes where they switched and did like this shaky style. And I'm like, you're in the kitchen, you're filming the kitchen, and the people are serving and talking. Stop shaking the freaking camera. Like, you just threw me out of the scene. So it's that intention. It's the same style. If you're in a fast paced, it's moving, it's moving, it's moving, and then all of a sudden, wait a minute, why am I reading like suddenly immersed in detail or
Yeah.
immersed in apparently the I said something that made the Amazon thing decide to speak. Or said something it thought I said its name. Anyway, it whatever the intention is, if it's this fast paced movement story and all of a sudden I'm getting into detail, then I'm like, wait a minute, you're throwing me out. It's like breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah.
Stop over explaining this to me. I don't know if other, like some people will come read a book and they'll be like, oh yeah, you get to these chapters and it's a lot of slog. And they'll be like, I skip over stuff. And I'm like, I don't skip over stuff. But I will say, when the style changes, or if the style changes, it throws me out. And then I get annoyed with the writing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's easy. I think it may be easy to do that if you go from action to a dialogue scene or from action into introducing a new place,
Yeah.
and I think we've been pretty good about pacing,
Yeah.
we're to where we're not throwing the reader out of what, the speed of the read.
Yeah. This last chapter, I mean, we rewrote it. We added a little bit in, took a little bit out. Because we got in, we were like, some of this detail isn't really like beneficial detail. It's not story built. It's like mundane actions. It would be like, how often in books, fantasy books, non-fantasy, whatever, how often in books does it say like the person went to the bathroom?
Yeah.
I'm like, they're on an 8-day trip. What are they doing for being able to use the bathroom? Or I had never thought about it. New York City had, you get into like Manhattan and stuff, go back into pre-vehicle era or even early vehicle era, where stuff was starting to modernize a little bit. And by that time, there were like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people living in New York City. So go back, like the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, isn't Leonardo, The Gangs of New York?
Mm-hmm.
That time period, there are horses and everything like that. So something they didn't show in and I don't know, movies, the Scarlet Pimpernel. I love that, the version that with Jane Seymour, and they're in these cities. Horses are everywhere. Horse-drawn carriages. There's cattle. We just talked about in this book. They're on a caravan. They have a caravan of wagons and with horses and oxen all lined up. Well, they're lined up there. They're waiting to go, waiting to walk out. Well, while they're standing there waiting, all those animals are crapping all over the place. And I think it was one of the things that I read was that it was like 40,000 tons. 40,000 tons a day
Of manure.
That had to be shoveled out of the city streets. 40,000 tons. And I'm like, yeah. Every single street up and down, there were people walking. And it also makes me think of, there's a movie, Support Your Local Sheriff, the comedy movie. It's hilarious. Love it. Love that movie. In that movie, in the beginning, it starts out with the main character guy arrives in town, and first you're following, there's a lady that's there, and she walks out, and there's 2 wagons that are stuck in the mud of the street. And they're like almost axle deep. and they're stuck because they're both tried to go the same direction, and now they're in front of each other. And one of the guys like, "You move your wagon." He's like, "No, you." But they're trying to tell each other who's got the right of way. Well, they're like knee deep in this mud, and then they start getting in a fight, and then before you know it, there's like 50 people in the street, all fighting each other in this mud. And then the lady go head first down into it, and then falls backward, and everybody ends up like that. They're just covered. And after reading that, like, this main street up and down would have had these wagons. Most of it's not mud. It's not mud that they were falling in and slopping in. Like, no wonder they're like, you think about like the plague, how much was, there were rats and the fleas on the rats and whatnot. How much was it exacerbated by you're in this populated area and there's thousands of tons of manure is what you're walking through to go anywhere in town constantly.
Yep.
Unless like you have shovel, like people that go through and shovel it. And if the street's not cobblestone and it's just permeating into the mixing in with the dirt, like that is the street. And how bad would towns smell? You don't get any of that detail in any of these books. In the Wheel of Time, Camelin, they're riding through Camelin, and all the streets are paved and everything. And there's people going through, but there's also horses and wagons and ox carts and, the caravans and all this stuff. Or Valen Luca with his menagerie that's traveling through town and all the stuff. I'm like, I've been to a circus. I've been at a circus when in the middle of the circus, the elephant takes a dump right there in the middle and everybody laughs. Oh, it's hilarious. Valen Luca had 3 elephants and all kinds of horses and all this stuff. And they set up and then everybody rides their horses there. And then they slop through it. You know how bad everything had to smell in the worlds that people create. I mean, 40,000 tons of horse crap or some combination of horse and ox and cow manure every day.
Yeah, but we don't want to read about that. We don't need that kind of detail in the books,
I know, but maybe we're how long have I just talked about it? I don't know. Maybe nobody else is. Maybe other people. Maybe you're listening to this going, "What the crap are you talking about?" No pun intended. But yeah, just you think about the actual lifestyle of stories, Tawara and Athandra traveling with Elman. And you're riding along and then you're like, I gotta pee. I guess I'm gonna go over here and squat down behind this bush. Or number 2, it's a number 2. And there was when was toilet paper invented? Like 1890s? Maybe it was early, but no, it might even been later than that. A roll of toilet paper.
1850s.
1850s. Okay, I was gonna say 1850s first, and then I was like 1890s. But yeah. So for all of history before 1890, like, well, don't ever touch anybody's face with your left hand. Don't eat anything with that hand. I mean, in the Wheel of Time, the people in the Wheel of Time didn't have toilet paper. The Aes Sedai didn't have. Did they channel their butts clean? That never came up.
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't want to use toilet paper until the 1930s, though. That's when the first splinter-free toilet paper was.
Oh, man. Yeah, what about that? Oh, I mean, think of how much money the Aes Sedai could have made if they're like, the 1-power wipes.
Yeah.
Keep yourself fresh with 1-power wipes. which going a little, that lends a whole nother meaning to sardine that was touched by the Dark One's taint. Wait, what are you talking about? But I do. I love detail in story. It's like we talked about with food. How much detail should there be in food? But
Yeah.
then you get into, well, how exotic can you make the food when literally whole communities, like, they have no idea what cinnamon is.
Yeah.
There'd be whole communities that unless a wagon came in, be like, we don't have no salt. There might be people that they grew up and they're like, they eat something. What is this? What's salt? Salt? What is this? This is amazing. I've never had it before. Imagine going back in time with a little bottle of MSG,
Yeah.
shaking that on. Oh, you like that? You got that fish that you made? You cooked it in a little soup there. Let me do this. Shake this in there.
Yeah. But, in the worlds like the world we're creating and the world of most fantasy, you go back to basically medieval times when people didn't travel more than 5 miles from their home ever.
Yeah. But I mean, we do it in our world too. Like a lot of stuff, a lot of like spices, seasoning, stuff like that is intermixed within our societies.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, go to you don't even have to go to medieval times. Go to Oklahoma Territory in 1840 and somebody who just moved out there. Unless they traveled into, like, somebody who they go out in the prairie and they just live out there, unless they had contact with had someplace they could go, they'd go get like bags of salt and flour and maybe sugar.
And
And
that
then
was all you had.
whatever they grew or raised. And that was it.
Yep.
Which in the book, I think I talked about the book before, A Taste for War, or A Taste for War, or A Taste of War. Anyway, I can't remember. It's an interesting book to read. It's the culinary practices during the Civil War. Because, the saying goes, an army marches on its belly.
Yeah. There's another one called Hardtack and Coffee.
Yeah. And there were soldiers that on both sides, both on the north and the south, that would be in hospitals. And in the hospitals, nurses and people working in the hospitals would try to do stuff, try to make the people that are injured, the soldiers that were injured, make their lives a little better because they're injured in the hospital, maybe dying. And at one point during the Civil War, they started putting, there's journal entries of multiple people, multiple soldiers, that they got brought soup. And they went to eat it, and they're like, "What is this?" And they're like, "I'm not eating this. What's even in here?" And they had started using herbs.
Mm-hmm.
It would be like, Jared, I'm bringing you this bowl of soup, and I put some parsley and some basil and some green onion in your soup. It's not a bowl of water with boiled meat and salt.
Mm-hmm.
And then some cut up vegetables. It's not just vegetables with meat and salt. I'm like, let's add some oregano and a little thyme and a little parsley. Put that in there. But then those little green things float on top. And there's literally journal entries of people seeing those and they're like, "What is this?" And the nurse saying, "That's herbs. It's something that makes it taste." And they're like, "I'm not eating this." They throw the bowl of soup across the hospital room. Like, they've never had parsley. They've never had herbs.
It's too much detail in their story.
Yeah. And because, some of the people, like some of the nurses that might be in a town or in a city, but these are farmers, people from out wherever. They're like, they don't know what the heck that is. That wasn't that long ago.
No.
It wasn't very long ago that literally, if you're making soup, if you're making stew, your stew is I chopped up some meat, I chopped up whatever vegetable I had, and not even some of them they had even like they put peppers. Literally, one of the journal entries was they had some peppers in their food, like mixed with their meat
Mm-hmm.
to try to make one to add flavor, two to make it go a little farther because the meat was like on the verge. And they're like, well, we're trying different things, and the person wanted meat and potatoes. And when they said they wanted meat and potatoes, they literally wanted meat
Mm-hmm.
and potatoes without anything, without anything else. That's what they were used to. That's what they ate. And they threw a fit. And it was like, you're trying to poison me. You're trying to kill me. Like witchery. Like, if you're getting that upset over, you don't know what a green pepper is, and it's in your food with your meat, trying to stretch out your chopped up meat and potatoes, and somebody added some peppers, and you don't know what it is, and you think they're trying to poison you with this crazy witchcrafty food. No wonder Salem happened. I mean, when you talk about witchcraft and Salem witches and stuff like that, they were probably just putting parsley in their soup. you know, it's mind boggling to think.
Well, and if you bring that around to the writing world, it's too much detail in their story.
Yeah.
It throws them off. It's not what they want.
Yeah.
And it's the same in a story. You can get to where you have, if you're going along at a quick pace and you're used to, or you want just the details that involve the moving of the plot forward, and then suddenly you throw that in.
Yeah. But I guess my this rabbit hole or winding path we've kind of gone down is from a detail perspective and from a story perspective. The setting of most fantasy stories take place in the equivalent, like you said, of some medieval time.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about enjoying, like, what types of food, what types of different foods would they have? Well, unless you come up with some strange exotic thing that might be particular to that region, really it would be like, well, it's kind of like they live in Ireland and they eat potatoes.
Yeah.
What else? Well, they raise sheep. They have sheep, they have potatoes. And when they're on the verge, when they're really hungry and they're like starving, they stuff a sheep's stomach with whatever they can find and cook it. Because you can cook it inside a stomach in like the coals of the fire.
Yeah.
You know?
And we go back to that as writers too, like especially when people are traveling.
Yeah.
Cheese and bread.
Yeah.
Because that's
and
what
maybe
they would have
dried
had.
meat.
Yeah, maybe dried meat. Because that's what you would have had in that, so there's no need to spice up the writing, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking more of, I think, and we do it in a lot of writing, kind of looking past, well, what is the reality?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you have a cook wagon, the cook wagon's going to have, casks of flour or sacks of flour and a bunch of cured meats, as much as they can fit in the wagon, and bags of salt.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, that's mostly it. And water. You got to have barrels of water. And enough barrels of water to be like, unless there's a river or there's a potable source of water between where you're at and where you're going, like, I need at least enough water to get me through all that time.
Yep.
So the reality of writing, it's as coming from the reader perspective, I'm like, yeah, I overlook a lot of that as I'm going. But now thinking about it in the reality of the worlds that people create, I mean, it skips over a lot of that, but it also kind of glosses over it.
Yeah.
Where they just had food. They had meat and they had cheese and stuff. Like, well, it's three people riding on horses with no supply wagons, and they didn't go collect supplies. They just took off riding.
Mhm.
And they've been riding for 5 days. And they've been riding hard. They haven't stopped. They're not hunting. They're not gathering food. What have they been eating for 5 days? What do they take with them?
Yeah.
You know, and when it talks about like they've been going for 5 days, they haven't come across any water, and they're drinking water out of a water skin. Like, what are you taking? Like going like sip. Well, that's it for today. That's all I get because we each have one water skin. That's all we have, and that's also all the food we have is the one water skin. But from a story perspective, a lot of that just kind of gets glossed over, unless it's really relevant.
Yeah.
To something in the plot. But it does, I think, create some holes in just storytelling in general, where if you really think about it, you're like, wait a second, how did they actually do that? You know, how did they travel across that wasteland? They didn't take any food. All we talked about was the experience and the adventure of crossing this wasteland and the desert creatures and the things they fought and stuff like that, not thinking about, well, they were out there in that desert for 5 days. They didn't have a pack full of food, but they kept stopping and eating.
Yeah.
You know? Anyway, just some interesting things, but I think maybe that's why I love stories that are consistent and that either have the detail and give me those Easter eggs, you know, or if it moves me along, that it stays at that, whatever pace is set, keep it at that pace. And then whatever level of detail you give me, keep giving me that level of detail. I really enjoy that aspect of reading, of experiencing what other stories people have to tell. Just a thought. Last time, our conversation with Caleb, we kind of turned it into this really.
Yeah. What are my gripes?
Yeah.
So
we were gripes. So we're like, what are things we like? I like the detail. I like learning that about New York. I'm like, that's really interesting. What if that was in a story? Part of it. Like, yeah, don't tell me the whole story about horse crap. But if you can do it well, like that could be could really be some stuff to mix into plot things that lead in different directions and make it interesting because of having to navigate a realistic world like that. So anyway,
all right. Yeah. Make sure you join us next week.
Yes,
Is a special week.
It is the last
chapter. Well, technically that was the last chapter. Yeah. It's the epilogue.
The epilogue of book 1.
And followed by that, we're going to dive into this book because we didn't want to give spoilers. So now we're going to dive into what's in this book.
Yeah. We'll probably get into even like some of the history stuff we didn't want to talk about because it would give away stuff for this book. Now we can talk about it.
Yep.
So, yeah, join us next week. We're going to have that conversation and we'll finish up with the epilogue. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming along for the ride so far. Till next time, go in good spirits. Thanks for listening to the Creators Guild podcast. Don't forget to get your copy of A Flight from Shadows, available on Amazon. While you're there, please rate it and give it a review. If you like the Creators Guild, please like and subscribe, and make sure to share it with your friends. Until next time, go in good spirits.